Hello, everyone, and welcome to Eclipsium's webinar, Don't Panic, How to Manage IT Product Risk with Supply Chain Intelligence. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. Before we begin, I did want to go over a few housekeeping items. We are recording today's session, and we will make the recording as well as a link to the slides available by tomorrow, so you'll see an email from me. If you do have any questions, feel free to go ahead and throw them into the Q&A panel. We'll take a few minutes at the end, if possible, to address those questions. And at this point, I would like to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today's session. First, we have Wes Dobry, who is our Principal Solutions Engineer here at Eclipsium, and he is joined by Tyson Supasadet, who is our Director of Product Marketing. Tyson, I believe you are starting us off, so the floor is all yours.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Yeah, I'm very excited to talk about this topic today. We're going to be talking about the supply chain problem for IT products. And, a lot of people think about supply chain security. They're thinking about software applications, which is really important, especially if you're building them. But as consumers of IT products, there's all kinds of IT products that we bring into our organizations. And we need to be starting to think about the supply chain. We'll show you a demo of a new offering that Eclipsium is rolling out. It's called the Guide to Supply Chain Security. And then we'll talk a little bit about vendor risk management problems that many organizations face, and then this new category of supply chain intelligence and what it can do and what problems it can solve for your organization. Okay, Wes, there were a number of headlines that had to do with supply chain security and IT infrastructure this year. Any of these strike you or that you want to comment on?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we take a look at some of the headlines that we see approaching or coming out in the news that relate to breaches that are occurring up in the supply chain, we had recently things like Intel's downfall, which was a severe CPU flaw that caused a lot of havoc within organizations that had to rapidly patch, no different than when we had Spectre and Meltdown a while ago. If we also look where we have recent articles around all the things with, Citrix NetScaler and the ransomwares afflicting those, and you have of course, ZenBleed and Citrix Bleed type of scenarios. And then we even have some situations like Gigabyte, where Eclipsium actually found a potential backdoor within them around an insecure update methodology. We also have one here around where the Mega Rack BMCs had some vulnerabilities that also Eclipsium was part of the research of discovery of that. Then the last one is one from just very recently around where NXP, a chip maker that had bad guys that were lurking within their environment for over 2 years. And ultimately, these highlight some of the scenarios where if we're a consumer of equipment, we can have people that are supplying that to our suppliers that could have bad guys and breaches that can exist for substantial periods of time without us knowing. And the only things that we have to protect ourselves today are what's in our current security stack, as well as contractual things to protect us monetarily.
Wes, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I believe that our researchers were able to find the vulnerabilities in the Gigabyte motherboards because a ransomware group had leaked some intellectual property the year prior, and then including like source code, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. So we did see some communications between a ransomware group where they were actually talking about how to leverage below the operating system components and where they could attack other organizations so that they could, take advantage of these scenarios within the supply chain to, infect organizations without actually going direct to them. So bypassing all the controls that an organization and an enterprise has by just hitting a lesser secured supplier to them.
Yeah, to me, that was very eye-opening. The NXP chip maker example, those are, I'm guessing, probably nation state attackers. So they will steal those designs and develop exploits and not let anybody know. But a lot of times the new tactic among ransomware operators is data extortion, right? So where they have your source code, they have your signing keys and all of this, and they're like, hey, if you don't pay up, we're going to publish it. And sometimes they might just publish it anyways, and that's a huge risk to the supply chain as well. I forgot, I was going to do a little intro with a water bottle. Now, to be honest, this is a bottle of water that I got from Costco, but I took the label off. Say, for example, someone gives me this bottle of water. There is no way for me to test it or even know if it's water, right? I have to, a lot of what's going to go into my decision of whether to consume this is how much I trust, the person giving it to me. There's no way for me to, like, I don't carry a field test kit, to test the safety of water. You were talking a little bit about contractual obligations, Wes. Can you talk a little bit about the trust that organizations are putting in their IT vendors? Yeah, and maybe I'll this might be a good segue for your next slide.
Yep, perfect. So, when we're doing things like purchasing IT equipment and when we look at how we're going to acquire stuff, we as organizations have always taken an approach of, let's trust this vendor. Let's do our third-party risk assessments of them. Let's make sure that we can mitigate and protect ourselves from it. But generally speaking, we usually have to go one of three different models for acquiring equipment or building solutions within our own organizations. That can be situations where if I'm a mature enough organization, I can do complete vertical integration where I'm going to trust nothing that I acquire. I'm going to manage every step of that process, and I'm going to build it myself. And in some of the largest organizations out there, this may be a perfect solution for them because they can do every single step of the process. But this is a very, very small subset of organizations. We find that most organizations, and just from many, many years of experience, we've all learned that we have to either buy a rolled solution or cobble together something throughout the what we can acquire. So whether that's a scenario where we build our own solution from components, where we trust the components that we're getting, and we do our attempts to verify these as a solution as a whole to mitigate our risks. But most of us as IT organizations, we have approached it from a scenario of, let me buy a whole solution. Let me buy that whole laptop. Let me buy that whole rack mount server. And that puts us into a very, very interesting scenario of trust. And I call that, the blind trust consumer, where we are blindly trusting every single vendor that we're talking to and just assuming that everything is good with them and every component that they have is good from their side. Mm-hmm. Can you go to the next slide, please? So if we think about what a typical device looks like, and a lot of organizations, you just simply assume that device was built in a single factory somewhere, and it comes together in a box and you unbox it and it's supposed to be good and valid and great. But as you start to dissect that device and you start to go and see, okay, now it has all these subcomponents within there, and then those different subcomponents have different pieces of code that run on them, you now end up in a scenario where it sprawls like crazy. And in a typical device, you can have scenarios where you've got different chips, storage, individual different, components on that board, and then all the different code that's running on those as well. So you now end up in a scenario where you have, in excess of 65 different direct suppliers over many different countries. And then to make up those components, you can have hundreds of factories that are generating either the code or the actual physical assets that go into these devices that we're purchasing.
It's incredibly complex.
Exactly. So, if we even just think of a simple system, we have an example here of a server motherboard here. And when we think about the individual components on this, we're all aware of things like your CPU, your BIOS that runs the device, your BMCs or baseboard management controllers, your NICs, and similar devices. But then when we start to dissect that and break that apart into all of those different bits and thinking about it from things of like lines of code, you end up in a scenario now where When we're looking at the stuff that's running on a VMC, it's a full Linux operating system with, a full Linux kernel that's generally unmanaged in almost every single environment. You've got data center accelerator cards that are running full kernels on them today, doing full policy engines. And when you start to look at it from this perspective, you now have a lot more areas of opportunity for attackers to go to.
Yeah.
So nice fun example here. If we take a look at the Death Star 1 here, you have a scenario where you look at this as a general space station, but when you start to break it down into its individual components, where we have the different Kyber crystals, and we have the hypermatter reactors running this device. But then when we start to look at those individual devices, and we can actually say, hey, this device has a vulnerability within it. In this case, the good old thermal exhaust port, where it has a backdoor into it with a very, very high risk rating and a very high susceptibility rating of it's going to be attacked. So in
Maybe
this scenario,
disclosed in 1977.
Exactly. So in this scenario, now we have a situation where, all the different parts come together as a whole and bring us potential risks to an organization. So we love this quote. And I looked at this, from when Ken Thompson said this in 1984, where he was actually receiving an award, if I remember correctly. And whereas part of that, he said, you can't trust code that you did not create yourself. And, he says, especially code from companies that employ people like me. And I love this approach because as an organization, we need to shift our thinking to approach things with a different perspective. We have ultimately looked at the things that we bought and the code that we've ran in our organization, that if it's coming from a trustworthy company, we should trust that code. And in a greater standpoint, we're finding more often than not, we need to make sure that from a zero trust methodologies perspective, that we're protecting ourselves with other controls in place that can perform validations, verifications of this code in ways beyond just simply trusting the supplier of it.
That is a perfect segue or lead up, Wes, to our new offering, the Eclipsium Guide to Supply Chain Security. And we've stolen a line from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Don't panic. We understand that, as we've pointed out, the supply chain for our IT products is incredibly complex. They're thinking about this bottle of water, again, there's not many ways that we can go about testing all of the different components and that go into our IT products. But you don't have to worry. Eclipsium is here to help. And here I'm going to give you a quick run through of our new guide product. So this is what we're looking at here is this is the early access version. I have different types of IT products. All together, we're looking at 4,800 different products from 11 vendors. Eclipsium is continuing to add to this catalog. If I click on client PCs, now you see I'm narrowed down to just 4 vendors, and there's 4,100 different products. I want to look at a specific HP laptop. So now I'm looking at only PCs from HP, and I can see here there's 966 of these. We allow you to search for any particular make and model. So if I put my EliteBook 1040, I can see there's 3 different versions of this 1040 EliteBook. I say I have the first one here, so I'm going to click in, and what we're showing you is that analysis. So say, my bottle of water, I can go to the guide for supply chain security, and I can say, what is my risk before I bring this into my organization? Or say I do have it in my organization, I want to know what are the ingredients. So what Eclipsium is showing you, we're showing you the provenance of the of the product. We're showing you a risk score that's made up of a composite of the vendor risk score as well as vulnerabilities in the product. And then here you can see that this is we've done the scanning of all the different components. That's why we've given it that verified check mark. If we move down, we can see the different components and even an SBOM that we can download. I'll come back to that. But first, I want to look at the different vulnerabilities. Here they're prioritized by the CVSS score. We also show the new first EPSS score that is supposed to be, a measure of how likely it is to be exploited. Coming back to the components, we can see there's firmware, hardware. If I look at hardware, now it's showing me just the hardware components. There's different types of components. I can look at the different CPU options available for this EliteBook 1040. What's interesting here is that with all of these Intel chips, I see they all have one vulnerability. I'm guessing that's the same vulnerability. I'm clicking here on the Intel Core i5 chip that can be included in this laptop. And here I see that, okay, Eclipsium has scanned and done a breakdown of the microcode on this Intel chip. We've given it a fairly low vulnerability score. When we go down, we see, oh, okay, it has this this one vulnerability that was discovered disclosed in 2022. This is actually the downfall vulnerability that we had discussed earlier. So I can see for this single component, what's really interesting is that here we have a linked products table. So for any component, any specific UEFI firmware or storage chip or a network card, I can go and see which IT products that component is included in. So for this Intel i5 processor, we can see it's actually included in over 6,000 different products. So that's, but for a different component, it might be lower, so that when there is a new vulnerability that's announced or a new threat that's announced through the that is from the supply chain that is affecting your organization, you can quickly go in and assess your risk, assess the impact of that supply chain threat to your organization. Okay, whoops, I didn't mean to stop my sharing. I meant to switch my tab. So I'll go back to the slideshow here and talk a little bit about third-party risk management. Before I go on, Wes, was there anything that you would like to call out from the demo?
Well, the one thing is around those linked product sets and really taking the intelligence around where risk can be brought in from a supply chain into a guide of where that may be applicable within your environment. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting when we started doing the research and development of the solution was when downfall was actually announced. We were able to very quickly, within minutes, identify every device that we'd ever found downfall in or had the specific fingerprints in. And so in this scenario, it was immeasurable from us from an intelligence perspective for how quickly we could identify every device out there, even before manufacturers had completely performed their publicizing of where that vulnerability was.
Yeah, it's a perfect example. When we think about third-party risk management and vendor risk management, there are a set of things that or mechanisms that organizations will employ to measure the risk of that IT vendor to their organization. So they may do an external cybersecurity assessment, and that's things like looking at their website, looking if they've been in the headlines, trying to understand from an external standpoint. And then you can ask them directly. You can give them a security questionnaire that they'll fill out. You can see, there's these different third-party attesters that will attest to their SOC 2 compliance, for example. And then there's other things that you can look at, like the financial status of the organization, the credit rating. Are there any trade restrictions on them? Even going into like corporate social responsibility. But what we're talking about here is what about the risk of the actual thing that you're bringing into your organization? What about the risk of the IT product itself? And that is increasingly something that organizations are thinking about when they're looking to conduct these types of third-party transactions, or especially engaging with an IT vendor. What we need is something like FDA labeling requirements for IT products, telling you exactly what's inside that IT product, all the different hardware, firmware, and software components, and are any of them potentially dangerous? I'm much more aware now of things like high fructose corn syrup. I want to know, how much of that is my family consuming. And then there's things like the crash test safety ratings from the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. They have on their website, they have a great comparison tool that you can go and look up different models of cars and see how they perform in terms of like a frontal crash, a side crash, and so on. And that is what we're looking, what is needed, I think, to stop, to get ahead of all of these, vulnerabilities and things that we bring in to our organization. Wes, can you tell us a little bit about how this new offering fits in with Eclypsium's what we offer overall?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we take a look at where Eclypsium has came from, we started life as a solution to help organizations verify and validate any risk below the operating system. And where that's really morphed is when we take a look at, we have this black box in the center where we now have added our supply chain intelligence guide to the mix with our supply chain security platform. This takes data from vendors like the major OEMs, like your Dell, Lenovo, HP, and others, and feeds into our data set, along with intelligence that we're pulling in from advisories, public sources, our own research, and ultimately creating a very large data set of where there are risks in products that we're purchasing, as well as using our platform to ascertain that risk within your organizations by collecting data from your PCs, servers, network equipment, even cloud and software side of things, to ultimately understand what products your organization has, what assets are running within your organization, and then digging in to understand what components make up those assets. So what pieces and parts go into the computers that you're using, as well as the SBOM or software bill of materials and firmware bill of materials on those specific devices themselves. We then take that information and move into a perspective of identification of risk within those components. Does that hardware have any vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, or risks on it? Or are there scenarios where the firmware components have anything hidden within them, whether that's a risk, misconfiguration, vulnerability, or even a threat through indicators of compromise and indicators of attack? Ultimately, all of this gives organizations that full perspective to take a true approach towards zero trust and not take a scenario where we're going to trust anything coming into our environment. Let us validate it before purchase by using the guide to ascertain risk for what we're actually purchasing. That way we have that knowledge going in to what controls we're going to need to put in place before we ever purchase the device. The second is using the security platform to ultimately identify anything that's when we receive a device. So is this device genuine? Are there any threats within it from the supply chain or through anybody that's touched it as part of the build process? But then ongoing throughout our environment, using it to detect and identify anything that may be occurring that brings our organization's risk. So that could, again, be vulnerabilities, indicators of compromise, or anything new that may happen. So if tomorrow there's a new ransomware that's doing a UEFI embedded threat, we are the platform that can help identify that and protect your organization from all the different types of devices from a vendor agnostic perspective.
That's great. Oh,
Yep. So we did do a little bit of asking out there in the wild about, how could this help organizations? And, we had a few responses from some CISOs out there, and they were looking at it from a perspective of, oh, well, I would use this to help us update our asset management and uncover a fleet of Dell devices. Let me understand, what risks there are in these older devices, and if I can mitigate those risks or if I need to replace those devices. Also, same scenario around networking gear, Cisco, at Palo Alto, or Checkpoint, looking at those, and when I'm cross-shopping across them, understanding which one brings the least risk to my organization and using, transparent flow of information from us to identify exactly where those risks are coming from and what that may cause for your organization's perspective. It's also looking into the history of those devices to see over the time which ones have had more issues with them. But this also is applicable for scenarios like mergers and acquisitions. You are bringing in a new organization and you're currently a Dell organization, but they use HP. Understanding what you're actually inheriting from a device perspective and how that's going to impact what our current security processes are. And then, of course, the last part is also, if you're looking at devices and you can get a good perspective of what their risk is, that can help you to allocate time, effort, resources to manage and remediate those specific products themselves.
yeah, I love this. It's all about trying to know what you're getting into, get ahead of it. I did see an excellent question in the Q&A around CMDBs and ERP and that type of thing, and we will address it. But first, we actually want to get your thoughts. So there, we have a form on the website, and you can access it by typing in eclipsium.com/early access program, EAP, and it will take you directly to the form. Where you can request early access to the guide. We're still building it out, and we want to work with design partners like yourselves to understand, do you want to integrate with your ERP system and things like that. So I urge everyone, if you're interested, please head over to eclipsium.com/EAP and request access to the early access program. So Wes, would you want to take this this question? The question is, does the Eclipsium guide integrate with any purchasing systems, ERP systems, asset inventory, or CMDB?
Yeah, I did answer in the chat, but I'll also speak through the answer. And ultimately, in initial first release as part of the early access component, our expectations are to have some form of a RESTful API, but we do plan to build more of those specific integrations. So that's actually key for being part of the early access program to help us gather that information about where these integrations will be beneficial to your organization, so we can prioritize those accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm glad that the person brought up, purchasing systems. Yes, absolutely. I think, I think this has a strong play in that vendor risk management space. Yeah.
Great. Well, we are hitting the time that we said we were going to, and I wanted to thank everyone again for joining us today. Like I said, we will be sending out a link to the recording and the slides, and hope to see you on the next webinar. Thank you, Wes, and thank you, Tyson.
Bye.